So, welcome everybody to another installment of one of our Flywheel webinar series. Today, we're going to be presenting BIDS, going through a lot of the solutions that we have, Flywheel has for BIDS. Maggie Mahan has been neck deep in BIDS ever since she started here at Flywheel and improving our solution. And she's going to be presenting kind of an overall what some of the new tools and solutions we have. And she's going to be presenting through a Jupyter notebook, and that notebook is public for people to look at while she's going through it. And and while we were and after the webinar is over, so that you can go through. Actually, I wonder if that in the chat we posted, where I think that might be not the right link. Yep. So I think we'll make sure we get the right one into the chat. There is a Q&A feature that you can utilize in Zoom. For those that are familiar with that, please use that if you want to make sure your question gets answered. We'll be monitoring the chat throughout the webinar as well. But with that, I think we will turn it over to Maggie, and we'll get started with the Flywheel and BIDS.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. As was mentioned, we will have this notebook available. It's largely a lot of explaining about BIDS, and then I'll be doing some demos as well in the UI showing that, but we will make this available and send that out to all attendees after the completion of the webinar here. So a few things that we'll be talking about today. First, I'm going to give a brief overview of what BIDS is, just to get everybody up to speed. And then I'll talk about Flywheel and how BIDS is just an overview of how we've got BIDS in Flywheel. And then I'll actually show a little demo of where the different parts of the BIDS curation process exist within the UI. Then I'll describe a bit more detail on the BIDS curation gear and the components that are necessary for that, the most important being the project curation template components, which will largely be what we're focusing on here today. And then I will finish off with another short demo showing how to extend the default project curation template so that you can get started doing this on your own. So the brain imaging data structure, or BIDS, is for the most part a file name convention and directory layout for organizing and describing these neuroimaging data sets. This is a global initiative that was started to make it easier for us to utilize these neuroimaging data sets across and be able to share them. I would highly recommend reading through the docs. They have phenomenally done a phenomenal job of putting these docs together online. You can also download a PDF of the latest BIDS specification and take some time to browse through that. I would recommend mostly to look at the common principles section. In there describes a lot of the different pieces to the BIDS specification that are extremely important. And I think it really gives a good sense of the things to look out for when you're trying to debug your own data set to get it into the BIDS format. This here's an example of a BIDS formatted data set, just showing one subject. So we have a subject directory. Then below that, we have different data type directories. This one is showing an anatomy. Which is showing a couple of different Nifty files along with some JSON sidecars that describe information about those Nifty files. We scroll down a bit, we have also a functional data type, again, a Nifty file here. But with the functional, we can also have things like events and physio files that also correspond to that Nifty scan. We can also have diffusion data type. And this, again, as many of you may know, will come with B values and B vectors that are associated data types that need to be coming along with the Nifty file. Then a BIDS formatted data set may have things like a code directory showing the code that was used for different parts of the processing and any derivatives that may have come out during analysis. And then oftentimes there's a participants TSV file that's describing information about all of the participants in the study. And then importantly, a dataset description JSON file, which is describing how the, which version of BIDS was used for the curation of the dataset, along with some other information about the authors and licensing and acknowledgements and that kind of stuff. So here are the most important parts of BIDS that correspond to what we're going to focus on today. These BIDS building blocks you can find in more detail in the common principles of that BIDS specification. Again, I recommend going through briefly on that at a minimum. So first up, we have a data type. So each file will have a type. It can be functional, diffusion, field maps, anatomy, MEG, EEG, etc. Then there's going to be pieces that are index, and those are in the little Pac-Mans. And these indicate a numeric value. So if you see index, that means that it should be 01, 02, some numerical value. Oftentimes these are prefixed with a 0 to sort of keep a consistent indentation throughout a data set. Then you will also see building blocks where there's a label inside the little Pac-Mans, and these are alphanumeric values. This means that you basically need characters or numbers. You can't have dashes or underscores or any kind of symbols in there that would violate the label building block. For example, if you have a task dash label in the BIDS specification, you might have something like task rest or task stroop, whatever task you were using during a functional scan, for example. Then another building block will be the suffix. So this is also an alphanumeric value that is located after all of the key value pairs and before the file extension. This is oftentimes something like bold or T1W or DWI, indicating the data type of that file. Lastly, there's an extension of the file name that follows the leftmost period preceded by any other alphanumerics. This is oftentimes the nifty, doesn't have to be gzipped. It could be just a unzipped nifty version, a TSV, those kinds of data files or extensions. So the BIDS file name convention takes all of these building blocks and places them in these chain of entities. These entities are key value pairs, and we sort of piece them all together in order to get the file name that we need to correspond to the BIDS standard for that given file. For example, the subject entity, you'll have sub dash and then a label. Again, we're going to fill in that label with alphanumerics describing the information about that subject. This may often be something like subject 1, subject 2, etc. So for example, an anatomy imaging data file, the top description, this right up here, is going to be the sort of structure that we need in order to build that file name for the file that we are interested in. This includes stacking these entities together, so subject, session, acquisition, etc. The brackets indicate that that particular entity is optional. So in the case of the anatomy, the subject is not optional, but the rest of the entities are optional. We know that our data type is anatomy here. And so because of that, our modality label options are described here. These options are specified by the BIDS standard, and these are the only options that we would have available for this particular file type. In this case, we are looking at a nifty file, so our extension is going to be, again, .nii.gz. So we will fill in the above structure using any index or labels that we need for each of the entities to get to our file name. So for example, if we have the subject entity, we have a label of 42 indicating that that's our identifier for the subject. And then in this case, we're showing an example with an acquisition of MP range. So we're filling in the label with MP range. And then we have our modality label, which in this case we're labeling as T1W. And then again, the nifty extension. So we stitch together each of these entities with underscores. So the example shown at the bottom indicates the pattern that we are going to need for this particular file, and then how we would actually fill in that file. Again, this comes back to a lot of the common principles that I would recommend you look into. It will save a lot of time when you're trying to debug if you can understand how those entities are stitched together and that labels need to be alphanumeric. So for Flywheel, there's a couple of places where you can find more information about the overall view of how we use BIDS within the Flywheel system. I gave a talk at OHBM that covers broadly covers import, curation, export, and analyze. We have lots of tools available within the Flywheel system for you to use BIDS alongside your research workflow throughout. Also on our documentation page, you can start with the BIDS overview, and then there's a good deal of documentation there that we are going to continue to add on to and give some more examples in overview of how you can use BIDS in Flywheel. So the most important parts of the Flywheel BIDS involve three pieces that we're going to get into more detail today. So curation in Flywheel is the process of producing BIDS metadata that maps your Flywheel project to the BIDS standard. This metadata we have stored in the info.bids attribute that is accessible on each of the containers within the Flywheel project. And then importantly, we have this template, which is a JSON file that is used during curation to populate this metadata. To show a bit, make that a little bigger. To show how the Flywheel hierarchy corresponds to the BIDS standard hierarchy, here's a bit of a graphic to sort of show what that is. So projects and subjects and sessions are very much thought of in the same way. And then when we think about acquisitions in Flywheel, in BIDS, we're thinking about data types. So again, anatomy, functional, diffusion, MEG, those kinds of things. And then we have files in Flywheel. But that corresponds to our BIDS file names that are going to be used to complement the BIDS standard with your Flywheel project. Now I'm going to show you a couple basic things in our UI. So I'm go ahead and launch our instance here. And I have set up a project for us to take a look at. So this project has one subject in one session with a couple of different acquisitions. We've got a couple anatomy acquisitions and a couple functional acquisition and a diffusion acquisition. We're going to focus on the anatomy acquisitions throughout the remainder of this webinar to show how we can get these into the BIDS format. So if you've got your data set in Flywheel and you would like to get it into the BIDS standard, we can run the BIDS curation gear. So I will go ahead. The BIDS curation gear is a utility gear. Select BIDS curation. We did release a latest version, I think a couple weeks ago at this point. So I encourage you to have your site admins upgrade to the latest version to take advantage of the features available there. The configuration for BIDS curate, you can curate an entire project, or if you deselect this, then you're going to curate just for a subject. When you're debugging and trying to get a project into BIDS curation, I would recommend focusing on one subject at a time, get that sort of sorted, and then apply the information to the rest of your project. In this case, we have one subject, so it's a moot point at that point. Reset, we'll come back to later, but at this point, we haven't actually run BIDS curation on this gear, so it's going to start from the very beginning. We'll run this gear. We can then go over into our provenance tab. We can see that the curate BIDS gear is running. It's a very quick gear. We now have a green check mark. We can look at our log. Everything looks good in the log. Now we can come back over to our acquisitions And one of the things to keep in mind is once you run BIDS Curate and you would like to use the BIDS view, is you need to refresh your browser for the metadata to take hold. Now we can click on BIDS view and you can see that we have been able to capture the information necessary for this. And actually I made we'll come back over to our presentation. So that's a broad overview of the functionality that you can use while you're using the Curate BIDS gear to view your data in BIDS curated format. This will show an example of switching between the Flywheel metadata or the Flywheel view and the BIDS view. So on the left-hand side, we've got our anatomy files, both of our anatomy and the BIDS view. These will then come under that data type anatomy. Same for diffusion and the functional. Now the curation gear takes the input project curation template, which is important, and we'll go into more detail on that. Again, the process of the Curate BIDS gear is to produce BIDS metadata that's going to map your Flywheel project to the BIDS standard. So what that means is we're going to take a Flywheel container, whether that be a project, a session, an acquisition, or a file. We're going to fill in and stitch together the BIDS building blocks that are applicable to that Flywheel container. And then we're going to ultimately output metadata that is hosted under the info.bids attribute in every container across the Flywheel system. I will again mention this project curation template, and I try to make sure that we're clear on these definitions because we use the template, word template, quite frequently. So in this case, the project curation template is our master template that is going to define the BIDS standard for the project and is used by the Curate BIDS gear for BIDS metadata mapping. Some knowledge of JSON schemas and regular expressions will be useful. I will show you a couple of tools that you can use later on when we're going through to extend our default BIDS v1 that will be useful in this process. The default project curation template is hosted in our BIDS client repository. The BIDS client repository contains all of the core functionality for Flywheel BIDS. This includes import, curation, and export. Within there's a BIDS-v1 JSON, and this is the template that is called if you do not have a template, a custom template applied. So Curate BIDS is going to default to this template, even if you have a project, a custom template at the project level. And we'll talk about these two very important points here. So if a custom template is not provided, the Curate BIDS gear will default to the BIDS v1. In addition, if your custom template is not JSON schema compliant or not named correctly, it will also default to the BIDS v1. And I'll show you how to identify which template you're using in a moment. The custom project curation templates, we have several that are stored in these BIDS template repository. We will be adding to that so that there's more examples of how to extend and how to use different custom templates at your project. If you're going to use a custom project template, you need to attach it to the project level, and the name of it must include project-template. For example, the custom-project-template.json. So with the custom templates, of course, you can build the entire template, in its entirety, or a couple of simpler ways to do so is automating BIDS curation using the repro in project curation template. So repro in, if you're not familiar, is part of the repro NIM Center suite of tools and frameworks. The repro in repo discusses how to set up your data at the console, at the MR scanner, in order to achieve BIDS compliance sort of immediately or in an automated fashion. This basically boils down to setting up your series description to be in a format that is understood and sort of already BIDS compliant, if you will. You can also extend the BIDS v1 JSON. This is quite, I would say, the easiest approach if you don't have a repro in, if you're not setting up your project in a repro in fashion. And in this case, you only need to modify components of the template that are relevant to your project. Now, we've discussed that there's a default template and you can have a custom template. So now we need to know, how do I know which template is being used by the Curate BIDS gear? In order to make sure that you have the correct log, I am showing now 2 logs. Make that a bit bigger. On the left-hand side is the default template log, and on the right-hand side is the custom template log. You'll notice in the red portion that's sort of at the top, then on the left-hand side, it just says getting the project, and then it's going along and curating the data set. On the right-hand side, there's a second info line that is indicating that you have a custom project template attached. And so it will state the name of the template that is attached at the project level within this log so that you know that Curate BIDS is grabbing the correct template. Again, this is important because if you don't have the template named correctly, or if it's not JSON compliant, the Curate BIDS gear will always default to BIDS v1 to try to get your data set into BIDS compliance. Now let's dig into the project curation template components. There are many sections involved, and it can be quite cumbersome, but we're going to break these down. So the most commonly, the most important sections, I would actually say, are the definitions and rules. There are some other sections that are important as well, but for today, we're just going to focus on the definitions and the rules. So I've loaded up the BIDS v1 template. We're going to take a look at the different components within this template. So that this, as you can expand this on your own, if you'd like to use this notebook at a later time to explore the different pieces of the templates. So here we've got our definitions and we have our rules. The definitions here, there are many, of course. At the top part, all the way up to here, these up top are what we are calling property definitions. These property definitions are pieces of information that are building up those entities, all right? So for acquisition, for example, we know that acquisition is a string. We can give it just this definition, a label, so that we can find it later. And the pattern is really what we're looking at here. We know that the pattern of acquisition label, the label that we are filling in, needs to be alphanumeric. So this pattern establishes that as a requirement. So these property definitions up top are the property definitions as they would be defined from the BIDS standard. This is not something that needs to necessarily change unless the BIDS standard were to change dramatically. The bottom down here after this portion are what we have are container templates. These container templates describe how the BIDS standard needs to be applied for that particular data type or for that particular aspect. So if we take a look down here at the inat file, this inat file is a container template. It has a description, some properties, and required. We're going to take this inat file and go through this container template in a bit more detail. We also then have rules. So these rules down below, there's rules for each of the different container templates. And we're going to look into the inat template and look at the rules and how these rules impact that container template definition. So again, within the definitions are container template definitions. These refer to the pattern template applied to a particular Flywheel container. These are going to define the BIDS standard for that particular container, whether that be at the project level or more commonly at the file level. Again, the container template is a portion of the project curation template that dictates the information needed to structure one container, such as our anatomy file. Let's just take a look at our anatomy file container template. Here we have a nat file. This is going to be the title of our container template. Then below we have our description. You can put in a string that describes whatever container template it is. Then this container template will have properties. In this case, the properties we have here are file name, folder path, acquisition, etc. You'll notice that these properties correspond directly to the entities that construct the file name for an anatomy file. Down below we have required. So this again corresponds to the BIDS standard, where if you've got the brackets, those are optional fields, and if they're required, which in the case file name and modality are both required for this. Now I just described how we have these definitions within these container templates. So what does that correspond to for us in Flywheel? Well, the BIDS metadata is the set of metadata that's attached to a Flywheel container that contains the information for the BIDS standard that is stored at info.bids, and then there'll be metadata. What does this look like within Flywheel? On the left-hand side is the container template we just went through that has all of the properties. So again, file name, folder, etc. Then on the right-hand side, I'm showing info.bids within the Flywheel UI. And you'll see that the properties that are defined on the left-hand side in the container template correspond to the properties available on the BIDS metadata in Flywheel. Now we're showing anatomy here, and so only the properties available for defining an anatomy file are going to be available here. They will be different for things like functional and for diffusion, where there's different properties that are important for describing that file. Now, to apply these container templates, which are definitions of the BIDS standard and often are not changing that often, we first need to determine our rules. And this is pretty much where the large portion of building your custom project template will occur. So we go through, Curate BIDS will go through and determine if an object that is encountered should have a container template applied. So this is the where clause of the rule definition. And then if we run into a container template that says, yes, we should apply this container template, we're going to initialize different sections for the chain of entities that are relevant to that data type and described within that container template. And this allows us to capture the BIDS metadata that's necessary to stitch together each of these entities for the BIDS file name. Now I will show the rules portion of the container of the project curation template. I'm again only showing the anatomy rule. So the ID is the name of the rule itself. And then next up, it will show the template. Now again, this is the container template. So this rule is applied to the container template titled anat file. Then we have our where clause. So we go through the hierarchy within the Flywheel system. We find an object, say a file, an anatomy file, and we ask whether these questions can be answered. And if so, then we will initialize. So in this case, is it a file? Is the parent container type an acquisition? The file type in this case, we're going to have it be nifty. The file classification, we are going to have it be structural. And in this case, acquisition label, which you can have if you so choose. Now, each of these pieces in the where clause are not required. You can have different where clauses that are trying to capture different pieces of information. Maybe you're looking for a different kind of file type. Maybe you're looking for a functional instead of a structural. Or you might find that the file classification measurement is something that you would prefer to have as grabbing that information. So if we know that this template has been applied it will say a NAT file in the BIDS metadata. So let's take a look at that real quick so that makes a little more sense. We can go into our BIDS metadata, which is stored on each container within the Flywheel system. I look at my BIDS metadata and you'll see down below I have template, and the value for that metadata field says a NAT file. This template here corresponds to the container template that was applied to that file. So if the container template is not showing you the correct value that you are assuming it to be, then it's something that maybe you need to change in your where clause where you're not selecting, you're not capturing that file and associating it with the container template it needs. Once we've identified that a particular object or file is going to be applied with that container template, then we can initialize some values. So in this case, we can initialize acquisition or different pieces of the BIDS file name. Again, you don't need every single portion of each of the entities that will construct that particular file name. You can only initialize the ones that are relevant for your project, or you can initialize all of them. So in this case, acquisition, we're going to initialize ACQ in our BIDS file name by selecting the acquisition label, and we're going to use a regular expression to capture that information to be placed into the ACQ portion of the BIDS file name. We'll show an example of this in just a moment. So now we're going to extend our BIDS v1 JSON. But before we get started, there's a couple tools. Step one, that's very important, is looking at a JSON linter to ensure that you have proper syntax. So this JSON editor is very useful for that. We can place our JSON on the left-hand side and then see on the output on the right-hand side. So I'm going to grab actually our extension that we're going to use here. So this is an extension project curation template that we are going to apply to our project as an example. And if I select, if my JSON is compliant and I hit copy, then on the right-hand side, everything is all good. Now, if you are missing a curly brace, for example, you'll see that there's an error. If there's an error, you have to kind of identify, debug what that error is. Oftentimes there's things like the curly braces or brackets that will that are important for JSON syntax, so take a look at those. Another important factor is these commas that are separating different pieces. So if I take out that comma, it's also going to show an error there. And if I try to copy it over, it'll also show this error over here. So I would recommend checking your JSON to make sure that it's compliant before attaching that to your project, so you know that you're at least using proper JSON syntax. Next up, we also have regular expressions, and there is a nice tool for regular expressions where we can put our regular expression up here and put our test strings down here. For example, I can go back to my instance and I can take my acquisition label and I'm going to copy that, bring it back over, and I put my little test string here. I can grab all of my nats and put those over here. And then up top, I'm going to place a regular expression in here. As we recall from the last discussion, I want to capture the acquisition. So I can take this regular expression, place it into my tester here. And with my test strings, you'll notice that the acquisition is going to grab the MP range and it's going to grab the space. So in both of these instances, we will be able to capture that BIDS metadata from our files to get to the appropriate BIDS standard. All right. Now, the extension that I just showed in our JSON linter, I also have here, so we can go through a little bit more details on what and how you extend a BIDS v1. So the top part, this is actually not just a short example, this is a full custom project curation template that you can use to extend the BIDS v1. So at the top, we just write extends and extends the BIDS v1. That is the only available default that we have at the moment, although we will be considering adding more in the future. Then we have our description. You can describe what you're trying to extend or put in some sort of definition behind that. I'm not going to replace any of our definitions. If you remember from the BIDS v1, the definitions up top include our property definitions and our container template definitions. Now, because I'm not changing the BIDS standard on those, and those follow the rules that I would like to achieve my BIDS compliance, I don't need to change any of those definitions. Now I'm going to exclude the BIDS ANAT file rule. So this is the rule ID. I'm going to exclude that rule ID. And then I'm going to create a new rule ID that I'm going to still use the same ANAT file template. Again, we're not replacing that definition of the container template. We're still going to be able to call that from the BIDS v1 in our extension JSON. We still have our where clauses, so the rules are constructed the same. We can add different rules. We can change our rules. In this case, I've added a measurement so that it will select any files that are T1, PD, or T2. And then in my initialize, I've actually changed the acquisition so that I can select this acquisition label using this regular expression. Now this regular expression is quite long. I encourage you again to use the editor regular expression to sort of get familiar with that and be able to play around. It's a good place to put in your test strings and then see that you're actually capturing the information that you would like to be capturing. So now I've got this extension template. I can go back to my UI and I'm going to go to the information tab here. And I'm going to upload an attachment. And this, I'm going to upload my extension template. Now my extension template is attached at the project level. I can see that here. I'll go back over to my sessions. I am now going to run this gear. And in this case, I'm going to use reset. So reset will actually completely eliminate all of the BIDS, info.bids metadata that you had done before. It will wipe that and start from scratch. And so we would like to start from scratch and use our extension template to overwrite all of the BIDS metadata that was previously available. So we're going to run this gear. We can go back over to our provenance tab. We can see that it is running and it should be very quick. We can look at our log. In our log, we again see that the project template, we've captured our extension template that was at the project level. It then goes through the hierarchy of your entire project and looks at each of them and then uses the rules within the template to match. Now our extension template doesn't have the project or project file container templates. Those are in BIDS v1, but it will select our new ANAT template or ANAT file based on our new rules and apply that template, container template from the BIDS v1. Then we can go back to our acquisitions tab. Again, after running curate bids for the metadata to take hold, we want to refresh our browser. And we can come over here to the bids view and we can see that we have captured the appropriate filing that includes the acquisition of MP range and includes the acquisition of space in there. We could then go through and extend further and grab another rule. So in the case of diffusion here, if we undo bids view, in the diffusion, I have acquisition and direction, and I've got those in my acquisition label, but that's not being captured by the BIDS v1 template. So what I can do is simply extend this template to find that same diffusion using those rules, and then use my initializer and a regular expression to select out the information needed to build up the label of that entity for the full file. Well, we already did that. So we are actually all good. I will take questions. We can go through more examples and kind of show people. I know it can be a lot to take in with the BIDS templates, but I'm happy to hang out and show some more examples here.
Well, thank you, Maggie. That was a very in-depth and whirlwind tour of all the tooling and the nuts and bolts behind the bid solution that Flywheel has. So thank you for taking us through that. Though I kind of wanted to go back. So I got a question as we wait for anybody that wants to throw a question in the chat or in the Q&A. But I can kind of lead us off here, just a little bit more of discussion around bids itself. You kind of mentioned that there's the bid standard, and that there is it kind of is an evolving thing. And I think many of those of us who are heavily or know more about bids understand that there's some versioning there, and that they're always adding to the standard. And one of the things that we do, I think, is our main template, and that you can talk to this, is primarily built around MRI data, right? And they are adding more and more modalities to this. Is this the extensions here that you're showing? Is that something where if somebody wanted to take some of the more new things that are being considered for the bid standard, is that something that could be a use case for these extensions?
Yeah, absolutely. So the default templates, and including both the repro in and then BIDS v1, will stay up to date with the current BIDS standard of what's being implemented. And so again, with those templates, on the top portion are the definitions. So those definitions that are describing both the property and the container templates will continue to be updated with the BIDS standard. So you don't necessarily need to change those. We at Flywheel will take care of that. Now, if you have a BIDS extension proposal, say with ASL data, or some of the other proposals that are coming up with the newer data, or additions that are not quite in the BIDS standard yet, you can certainly use this extension to overwrite any of those rules, add on new rules, add on new definitions, and it makes it a lot easier to not reinvent the wheel, because the BIDS standard will already be captured in the BIDS v1 default template, but instead you'll be able to sort of step on top of that and add to it. And we will have some of those available within our project template repo for examples that you can use to sort of debug on your own.
Yep, great. Yeah, I think that's, I know when I've been talking to Flywheel customers over the years here, one of the things I always stress is, that bid specification standard that you referenced, the read the docs is really good. And I think one of the things that we, say is that my message to customers is that in order to get your data into bids, because bids isn't one of these really fast growing standards of data sharing, and it's really useful for having standard inputs to gears and such like that, but in order to start, you really need to understand your own data, right? And that's where you need to start understanding is what type of modality this is. And the standard bid standard there, those docs are really good in explaining what all the terminology means if you're not familiar with it. I know we've run into things where I don't know exactly how my data is supposed to look at the end, and I think reading those docs is really where is a great place to start. And then once you kind of understand what your data is in, the state it's in where you're at now, and then what you want it to look like at the end, these are the tools that we're presenting today, that you presented today, Maggie, that are really there to get you from point A to point B, right? And that is the key. That Flywheel can help you map that data from how you've currently collected it, how it's named, to how it's going to look in the bid standard at the end. And I think you're showing here really well that we've got a lot of detailed tools, but I think that understanding that is really key um, to the whole process. So,
Maggie, I wonder if you could,
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I wonder if you could explain a little bit more about how the metadata gets attached to the containers before you run the BIDS curation process, because what you showed was it was already there, and they're running the other couple of steps before that.
Yeah, that was a bit of a fail on my part because I didn't clear out the project from my last testing last night for the presentation. But we can give an example. So let's do that. We can go into our information here, and I can actually delete this BIDS metadata, save that. I can go ahead and do that also for our other anatomy file, delete this metadata here. So those are on our two files. There's also BIDS metadata at the project level where these files are maintained as well, and up here at the project on the dataset description. So if we go back to our sessions and we have our two T1s that no longer have BIDS metadata available, and we run our BIDS curation gear again, we don't even need to select reset in this case because it doesn't know that info.bids is there, so it's going to start from scratch. And we'll run the BIDS curation gear. Again, this should be very quick. We have selected our appropriate template. We come back over to our acquisitions. We will again refresh to ensure that the metadata has been applied appropriately. Then if we take a look at our metadata, we can see that acquisition is filled in with MP range. We don't have any of these other values in there. We could indeed actually change some of these values in the metadata themselves to take place and then run in update mode. Again, each of these pieces to a particular BIDS standard will be different for different data types. So in this case, we've got our anatomy, and in the anatomy, we can we have things like, you know, this acquisition, CE, REC run those metadata. But then if we go look, let's say at the functional, and in this case, we take a look at this BIDS metadata over here, there's going to be, you know, task is one that's of course important to the BIDS standard for functional data types. So now this BIDS metadata is available. And again, this gets defined within our within the BIDS v1 template. So we could go back and let me let's go back to our, let's go through it over on here. Let's take a look at our definitions, for example, for the functional file. So for the functional file here, we can take a look at the properties that are available for a functional file, and we'll note that the file name, folder, path, and of course task that we just looked at are described within the container template, or defined within the container template. And these properties then correspond to the metadata that is available under info.bids in the Flywheel system. So you can define these, you can define more fields. It's an open-ended attribute, so you can define other fields that, for example, if you're extending to use one of the BIDS extension proposal data types and you want to include a data type that wasn't, that's not currently in the BIDS standard, you can define these properties for that standard, and then those pieces, those properties will be available as metadata within Flywheel under the info.bids. Does that kind of help, Andy? Maybe you have more to say on that.
Yes, no, that's right. That's good. I guess in this case, you uploaded Nifty files already, as opposed to no. I mean, where were the DICOMs in this project?
Oh, yeah. For the examples here, I was starting from Nifty files. And I actually gave them, of course, uh, pretty well defined and structured names. Um, now I see where you're going with it, Sandy. If you didn't have Nifty files already, which is often the case, you're going to import your DICOMs. So you import your DICOMs, then you're going to run DICOM to Nifty. DICOM to Nifty is going to look at the DICOM header and take out pieces of information that are useful for determining information that you would need for bids. For example, DICOM to Nifty will pull out the series description, and that series description, which is often populated into the acquisition label, which is up top here, will be available as metadata on that file, on all of the Nifty files if you run DICOM to Nifty. And then you can use that series description or actually access it through your acquisition.label if you've kind of gone with the default way that the Flywheel workflow occurs. Then this is the information that you would then be able to capture within your project curation template to parse out that information needed to construct your bids file name. So there can be other metadata that's available. We take another look in here. We were using the intent. So we were filtering in our where clause in the rules on the intent and the measurement. Those are options to be able to do that. Or for example, like if you wanted to ignore a particular data type or not have that template applied, you could do that in the where clause as well. But yes, a lot of the other metadata information that is available here would have come from, this was actually because I used our BIDS import functionality. And so the data was captured and added on here from JSON sidecars. But I think that might be for another webinar, is the metadata that gets translated through BIDS import and export, which are other tools that you can use if you already have a BIDS curated data set and you'd like to get that into Flywheel, or once your data set is BIDS curated and you would like to export, a lot of the additional metadata that is available on these JSONs will also be populated into those sidecars. So that goes back into the, I'm scrolling around, I'm sorry, I know that can be difficult. So we have our Nifty file, which you just saw within our within the UI, and then the sidecar here in a BIDS formatted data set. This sidecar, this JSON sidecar, we store as metadata on the file itself. And so these JSON sidecars will be produced with all of the metadata that is necessary. The info.bids metadata is used to construct the file name and tell it which folder to go to. And then the information that's contained within that JSON file comes from the remaining metadata that's there. Like if you need repetition time, that gets pulled out and placed into these JSON sidecars on BIDS export as well.
Yep, and I think going to Andy's point a little bit more too is that as you're importing data, in the normal Flywheel workflows, that one of the common ways of getting data in is through one of the Flywheel connectors from your scanner itself. And I think you mentioned this, Meg, in one of the beginning slides, is about repro in, and that standard of naming things on the scanner and how important that is, of having that as a when you're entering things on the scanner. The repro in standard helps you name your files in a logical way that then these templates can programmatically get the BIDS information from it and put it in. So that's a key piece of the entire BIDS ecosystem that Flywheel has. And it's one of the things that we've been pushing more and more for our customers to adopt. And we think it's a really great standard by those repro NIM folks. Yeah.
David Parker has a question in the chat there, and that's going to be a subject of a later webinar, I believe, because there's a whole lot more to the BID standard. If you have multiple T1 files and multiple runs of different files, you
Yep.
need to involve these run counters that he's referring to there. But I don't think we have time for that today.
Yep. I think that is a maybe a larger topic, so that is good to think about. And we, speaking of which, one of the things you'll see when you exit today, and we will have our follow-up emails, will be kind of a survey that you can take to kind of tell us how we're doing on not just this webinar, but our whole webinar series. And we love feedback for other ideas for what you want to know and what more topics we should dive into in these webinar series. The next one is in 2 weeks. We will be diving into, in fact, our esteemed David Parker will be is on deck for that one. He will be following up on what Caleb put together earlier this summer, was finding things in Flywheel with search and using that with our SDK. So look forward to that. And we've got another several more on tap for the rest of the for this fall and going into this next academic year. So unless I see other questions, I think we will let Maggie go today. Thank you again for taking us through this tour of our BIDS tooling. And as always, you can reach all of our scientific engineers at Flywheel through our support at Flywheel.io email. So if you think of something that comes up, please reach out, and we will get your questions answered that way. And we look forward to hearing from you as we go and seeing you at our next webinars. Any final thoughts besides goodbye?
I think I would just mention that we've got, if you're not aware, and we'll continue to send links, we have a Flywheel tutorials repo that contains, all of the notebooks and all of the materials that we present located in one place. So when you're trying to figure out how to do, anything with the SDK or BIDS, like this notebook, and all of the information will be provided. There's also additional notes sort of interspersed in here that will give more detail, that will actually be in Word format instead of through audio format, if that is a preferable method for you. So I encourage everyone to, stay, we're always adding to that repo with lots of different ways of doing things and showing users how to take advantage of the tools that we have available. So that's all I've got.
All right. Yep. And we'll be setting up those links within about 24 hours of this ending, with including a link of the recording of this. So if you have any colleagues that want to dive into this would be a great way of sending this link out and be on our docs.flywheel website here by the end of the week. So with that, we'll close and thank everybody for attending.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.